Hello guys, today I want to share with you one of my favourite books about ancient Egypt that I own. It's called Insiders Alive, Ancient Egypt. And I like it because it's got loads of really fun facts to help learn about the ancient Egyptians, but it also has lots of pop-ups and things as well, which make it just a bit more exciting. So we open up this book here. As you can see, there's one of those wonderful pop-ups. So that's a pop-up of an Egyptian boat. And this is just an overview of ancient Egypt, something that we've already looked at. So I'm going to skip to the next page, which is all about the rulers of ancient Egypt. Now, the rulers of ancient Egypt were very, very important and were seen as almost like gods to the ancient Egyptians. They were all powerful, and to be honest, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. I'm going to tell you about these today because it's going to help you with the work you're going to do. So about 5,000 years ago, Egypt became a single country with one ruler or one king. Before that, different rulers owned different parts of the country and ruled their certain little parts themselves. But around 5,000 years ago, this all changed and there became one main ruler who ruled the whole of Egypt. And he was called the Pharaoh. Pharaohs had a lot of power, as I said. He or she was the owner of everything in the land. The owner of all the pyramids, of all the gold, of all the food, of all the rivers, the deserts, of all the people. The Pharaoh owned it all. People believed that the Pharaoh could control how the River Nile flowed, even when it flooded, and how crops would grow. Horus was an Egyptian god who controlled the whole land, and we'll learn a bit more about these gods as we go on with our topic. But Horus was one of the gods that owned the land, one of the gods who was in control of the land. And they had a special link with these gods. The people of ancient Egypt believed that the Pharaoh had a link with Horus, so there in turn they could control what happened. So they were all powerful. When the Pharaoh died, Egyptians believed that they become part of Osiris. Now Osiris was the god of the dead. If you were the son or daughter of Pharaoh, normally the son, and your father died, who was the Pharaoh, you would then become the Pharaoh. Just like over here in England, we have, if the Queen dies or the King dies, then their son or daughter, the eldest, would then be in charge and become the King or Queen. A Pharaoh was simply the King or Queen of Egypt. Most Pharaohs were men, although there were a few female pharaohs, and I tell you now, they are incredibly powerful and incredibly well respected. But most of them were men, and we're talking over thousands of years the ancient Egyptians were around. And these men had one main wife, and their main wife would live in their palace with them, would live in the place they lived with their amazing buildings and their servants and their gold and all the food they would like. But the pharaoh could also have more than one wife, and his other wives would live away from that main building. But occasionally, pharaohs did have more than one wife. The queen's job, the pharaoh's main wife, was to help the pharaoh rule the country and make important decisions about where to build new cities and where to plant crops. Now you can see in the middle here, I'll try to zoom in. You can see this image here of a pharaoh and his wife, the queen. And they look quite different to how we look now, mainly in the way they dress. So the pharaoh here has a white crown, and this crown was first worn by the prehistoric Scorpion King, who ruled before Egypt became one united land. So before there was this united Egypt with just one pharaoh, this white crown was first ever worn by someone called the Scorpion King. You may recognise that name from a famous film. Here we have something called a ceremonial flail. Now this was an agricultural tool, so something that was used in farming, but pharaohs would often carry one, as the god Osiris is pictured to carry one. Down here, we don't have trousers or shorts, we've got a kilt. Now you may associate kilts with Scottish people in Scotland, but in ancient Egypt they would also wear a kilt. The king's kilt was made of white linen that was produced from flax plants, produced from crops that they would grow. This here is not a candy cane. You might think it's a candy cane, but it's something called a crook. A ceremonial crook was carried by pharaohs and also again by the god Osiris. So you can see how the pharaohs of Egypt would model themselves on these gods. And this in turn would help the people of Egypt believe that they were actually in touch with the gods and part god. Now if you look to the queen, she looks absolutely amazing here. She has all her gold jewellery on and she's got her gold headdress. And at the top here you have something called the royal cobra. The uricus, or the royal cobra, was on the front of the queen's headdress. This is a vulture headdress, and the vulture headdress looked like there was a bird sitting on the queen's head, but it wasn't actually a bird. It was just something that at the time was in fashion. And they often wear wigs as well. Women like the queen often wore wigs. Not everyone did, because they were very expensive, but the queen would. And she's wearing a pleated dress made from fine linen. So the pharaoh and the queen would wear the best clothes and the best jewellery and have the best gold that they would get from by the River Nile. And they'd be very well respected. Now I'm going to move the book over slightly. We're going to look at some things called symbols of power now. So if I try and zoom in a bit more, here we go. Up here, we have symbols of power. A pharaoh wore all sorts of crowns and for different occasions. And queens and gods also wore crowns. So wearing a crown like this, or like this headdress here, would show that you were in power. So there's one here, a feathered crown worn by Osiris. Now this is one of the other things I like about the book. I can turn this here now and go to my next symbol of power. This is an atef or an atef, which was worn above a headcloth. So you may have famously seen Tutankhamun depicted, and he has a headdress, and above that you would put your jewels or your crown. Moving on. This is called a blue war crown, because just like in modern age, the Egyptians had an army and they did go to war. Eventually, of course, they were overtaken, they were beaten, and their civilization did end. This is one we talked about earlier here on the Queen's headdress, which is called uraeus, or a royal cobra. Snakes often depicted in ancient Egyptian pictures, very powerful animal. And this one here is called the vulture, which was often worn at the front of crowns as well. So the vulture or the snake, very similar shapes actually. If you look at the vulture there, and look at the snake there. Then we have the red crown of Lower Egypt. If you want to find out more about that, I suggest you look that up and see if you can find out some more information about it. And then we're back to the white crown of Upper Egypt. I'm going to move it slightly down now. And we're going to look at this last little bit. Here we go. This part's interesting. The female pharaoh. So the female, the girl, the woman pharaoh. Almost all pharaohs were men. There were only ever 4 women pharaohs. The most powerful woman pharaoh, I can't really pronounce this one too well, was Hatshepsut. And she ruled Egypt for 22 years and built a great temple in the desert. Again, my pronunciation of ancient Egyptian names isn't great. Deir el-Bahari. And then you've got the boy king down here. He's known as the boy king because he became king when he was only very, very young. And his name, Tutankhamun. Probably the most famous of all the pharaohs. And that's because in 1922, so we're nearly 100 years ago now, an Englishman named Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. And the amazing thing about his tomb was it was full of treasure. He was a treasure hunter and he found the treasure of the ancient Egyptians. Now, Tutankhamun himself was only about 8 years old when he became a pharaoh, so the same age as most of you, and he was in charge of ruling the entire country. Unfortunately, people believe that he did die when he was only about 11 years old, and you can look up, there are lots of different theories about how he died and why he died. Maybe that's something you can look up later. So that's the page there I've just shared with you about rulers of ancient Egypt. And the next page of my book goes on to look at everyday life. Maybe we can look at that another time.